Hey everyone, Sarah here, and here to talk about all sorts of psychological topics to improve and enhance quality of life after being a child athlete. Yay, gymnastics. Today, I'd like to talk about psychological hardiness. So let's start off with story time. In my gymnastics years, I valued toughness above pretty much anything else. As an example, around the age of 14, I developed 3 stress fractures in my elbow. This was as a result of the months leading up to that. I had a broken growth plate in my left wrist. So then I started babying it and I was doing things at weird angles. So then I started impacting my elbow weird. Anyway, just like a typical gymnast would, I continue training on the elbow. Every once in a while, it get too painful and we go back and get x-rays and oh, it's still fractured. And I take something like 2 or 3 weeks off, but not really off. I'd still be doing my full training, but maybe a little bit less of stuff on my elbow. And I continued doing that over the course of a year until it got to the point where it was just, I couldn't take it anymore. And at that point in time, we decided to go forward with a surgery. In this case, what happened is there was so much pounding that my bone just eventually gave up and died. So after a year of training like that, it just became too much to handle. Sorry about that. I've got my cat talking to us in the background. I ended up going ahead and getting surgery. Now, the plan was to go in, drill some holes, some small little holes into the bone to stimulate growth of the bone back, and hopefully, we'd have some turnover of the dead tissue and it would get back to being regular, healthy bone. Apparently, when the surgeon started pressing with his drill onto the bone, it just crumbled. It was too far gone. They weren't going to get to the point where it was actually going to regrow. So this is probably pretty gruesome, but they had to carve it out. And then it was just up to my elbow to start healing back. So relatively involved surgery. Guess what I was doing 3 days later? So maybe a normal person might say, oh, you're resting. I mean, duh, what else are you going to be doing 3 days post-op? I was back in the gym though. Not only was I back in the gym, I was back in the gym training about 6 hours a day, and I was swinging on the bars. I was trying to get back into the sport as fast as possible. And so essentially my first practice back, I was already swinging on the bars. I was already doing handstands, but 90% of the weight was on my left arm while 10% of the weight was on my right arm. And I was going to just step that up bit by bit until it was back to being 50-50. I really wanted to show that I was committed to the sport still. I didn't want my coaches to think I was lazy. There's a whole story about that, and that's for another topic of things like maybe gaslighting or maybe just a general pressure to get you to do things that aren't really healthy. That's a bit of a long story. I'm not going to tell it now, but essentially the coaches were doing and saying things where I felt that I had the need to prove that I cared about the sport and that I was going to push myself. So therefore, that's what I was doing. Oftentimes, athletes will take 3 months off entirely to not put any weight or strain onto their joint after a surgery like that. But I was already back in full competition. I had traveled from Texas to Canada, and I was already competing on an elbow that had just been operated something like 2 or 3 months prior. I was a really bad patient. I wasn't even really doing all the physical therapy that I was supposed to. I think I still kind of have some limited mobility. Can't really touch my shoulder properly with this arm. What are you going to do? If I injure myself in the future, definitely going to be more diligent with physical therapy. Yeah, don't do what I did. Physical therapists are awesome. Do it. It's really helpful. But it turns out that being hardy, I would have thought that hardy means tough, that kind of toughness. But it turns out that being hardy doesn't actually mean being hard on yourself. There's an institute called the Hardiness Institute, founded by 2 researchers that are really core to the early days of the research on the topic. And here is a quote that you can find on the homepage of their website for the Hardiness Institute. People who soar are those who refuse to sit back, sigh, and wish that things would change. They neither complain of their lot nor passively dream of some distant ship coming in. Rather, they visualize in their minds that they are not quitters. They will not allow life circumstances to push them down and hold them under. The version of me that was swinging on bars 3 days after elbow surgery would have absolutely interpreted this as never take a break, that's for slackers. Don't complain, that's for whiners. Just keep moving forward no matter what. Present day me knows better than that, and I can take a much more nuanced perspective. And I think there's a lot more nuance in this quote than a version of me from 15 years ago would have realized. What hardiness essentially is just being really actively engaged in your environment. Being able to see change is just a natural part of life rather than resisting it and getting into like, oh, woe, it's me. Why can't things just stay the same for a while? I get stuck in that trap a whole lot. And believing that you can control your situation and do what you can when possible. Of course, you don't want to take that to an extreme because there's going to be a lot of things in life that you can't control. But the important part is that you do look for what is within your realm of ability to be able to change. So in the exact technical terms are defined in a few different papers. One of them that I'm going to reference here is by Suzanne Kobasa, published in 1984. I will include the DOI and link below in the within the blog or below the video, wherever this video ends up being. And so these are the 3 C's of hardiness: commitment, control, and challenge. Commitment really means being engaged in the environment. So you're showing curiosity about the people involved in the situation. So you're really an active participant rather than withdrawing from your environment in the challenging situation. I already talked a little bit about control. So that's control rather than feeling powerless or a sense of like learned helplessness. And finally, challenge. It's just having the expectation that change is a part of life. Challenge is an opportunity for self-growth and development. Obviously, that's not to say that sometimes things aren't going to just really suck and be awful. And sometimes there are situations that are truly outside of your control. And it's really difficult. So this definition isn't to minimize that some experiences truly can be difficult to bounce back from. But what they are saying is the more commitment you show and sense of control that you feel and embracing of challenge that you actively engage with life in that way, the more likely you are to be resilient and be able to bounce back from difficult situations and grow as a result. This kind of all kicked off with the famous IBT study, the Illinois Bell Telephone Company. Their parent company was AT&T. Anyway, IBT, they launched a 12-year study of their management team and started in 1975. And in 1981, they let go of half of their employees. It was a time of great uncertainty within the industry. A lot of changes were happening. And of course, it was really destabilizing and stressful. Like in any company, when there's that much uncertainty and a lot of people being let go all at once, a lot of people are going to find that stressful. They don't know if their job is going to be there tomorrow. So about 2/3 of the employees ended up actually even having health issues. A lot of them were just feeling like there was no direction. They didn't know what to do. I think one of them had gone through 10 supervisors in the space of a year, which like, oh my gosh, it's super destabilizing. You never really have the chance to, build rapport and momentum with a specific supervisor who's going to take care of you and look at your career development. But there was the remaining third that did fine. They didn't really seem to suffer health consequences. They did acknowledge that it was a stressful environment, but overall, they were able to keep both feet planted on the ground and do relatively well and didn't have the same poor health outcomes that the remaining 2/3 of the managers at the company did. So obviously the next question is like, All right, what's the difference between those two groups? What's the secret sauce of that 1/3 that remained healthy? And as you might have guessed, that's hardiness. So they had the 3 C's of commitment, control, and challenge. And they also looked in the study at other factors such as social support and exercise. It turned out that hardiness was even more strongly positively correlated to resilience during that time than was social support and exercise. Social support being in second place after hardiness, and finally being exercise. And they found that having all 3 was the most beneficial. So having one of the 3 C's was better than 0, 2 is better than 1, and so on. So in your own life, if you want to look at it, you can evaluate whether you think that you have all 3 C's. Is there one that you can ramp up? There are a couple of different assessments that you can do to measure your hardiness. There's the Hardiness Survey 3 or the Personal Views Survey 3. And then there is the Hardy Survey, which is offered by the Hardiness Institute or the Performance Effectiveness Index. So a couple of different types of assessments and surveys that you can take to evaluate your own hardiness. So like, obviously we've talked about the hardiness sounds great. How do I get myself more of that? Interestingly, in the study, once they were able to identify, okay, here are the 3 C's, the third of managers that were doing better, they seem to have a strong command of that. So then they went on to do a bit of an experiment and training program to help develop hardiness in managers. So that lasted about 15 weeks. And these managers were taught 4 different techniques. So first was basically reframing. So to look at a stressor and instead of viewing it as a threat, to see where there is an opportunity and to actually get excited about facing it and see opportunities to grow and maybe move their career ahead. Now, if someone just wasn't able to see that, it's a really creative exercise, and creativity kind of can sometimes get shut down when you're facing a lot of stress. Kind of being in the fight or flight all the time, you have to be laser focused. So sometimes part of the survival mechanism is to try to find the most sure path forward and also focus on the negative because you're being vigilant to threats. So that kind of positive reframing didn't necessarily work right off the bat for everyone. So the next step after that would be to focus inwards and see if there's maybe any sort of emotions and fears getting in the way. So then they would tackle those first before trying the positive reframing again. But if that still didn't work, then they used a compensatory self-improvement technique. That's kind of interesting. So essentially it means that if you take a hit in one area, I'm paraphrasing the definition on the APA Dictionary of Psychology. If your self-esteem takes a hit in a certain area, maybe you received a performance review and they said like, hey, you really suck at being organized. You look at another area where you have a lot of strengths and you have high self-esteem, and you start really focusing on those and building your self-esteem there. Like you are really good at leading a team and helping to build a cohesive unit. And that starts to build up your self-esteem. Maybe you're ready to then go work on an area that is an opportunity for improvement, as they would say in the corporate world. Otherwise, the action plan really is the ideal part. What you're trying to get to is to be able to create a plan of action, to be able to tackle the situations that you're faced once you've identified an opportunity, to be able to act on it. The ultimate goal of all of these techniques is to be able to then create an action plan to work towards the opportunity that you identified, to be able to look at that silver line and be like, hey, this is what I can make out of this situation, and go out and do it. Be able to reach those goals that you set for yourself. So there you have it. Essentially, you can be hardy without necessarily being hard on yourself, as in like super self-critical. That might actually be counterproductive, but you can be actively engaged in your environment. You can look for what is within your locus of control, So in the end, you can be hardy without being hard on yourself, or at the very least, not being very harshly self-critical and being hopeless. You can actively engage in your environment, look at the situation and determine what is within your locus of control to change, and then look at change as a part of life and see as an opportunity to grow and to act with that engagement and sense of control. And there's a couple of different ways that you can increase your hardiness. And ultimately, what you're working towards is to create an action plan to move something forward and to be able to tackle the challenge that was just thrown at you. So, cool concept. Again, a note, if you have 3 stress fractures in your elbow, probably not a good idea to keep training with it. You can be hardy without having to do that. And signing off.